Hello everyone and welcome to a new segment that I'm calling Tea and Total War, where I have on a guest and we talk about all things Total War. My first interview is joining us live via Skype from all the way across the pond.
I'm Jack Lustard. I'm the game director on Thrones of Britannia.
Unfortunately, Creative Assembly couldn't get his camera to work, so I decided I needed to improvise. Now I've actually been really curious about this. Do you get to pick the period for the game, or is it something that you sign on with?
No, I chose the period.
Really? So why this one?
I love this period because it allows you to tell the story of what happens after a major event. Like everyone knows about the Great Viking Army, but telling that story again to me feels like we'd be treading the same ground you sort of saw in Attila with the Huns, where you've got this big force coming in, destroying everything. And similarly with the first Warhammer, where you had the Chaos Invasion coming in and destroying everything at the end. I'm really interested in the story, sort of what happens next, where you've had this sort of table flip moment where the old political order's been swept aside and there's this opportunity for lots of different players to rise to the top and take control.
You know, it's funny you say that. I just got done reading a book called In Search of the Dark Ages, and it made that exact comment about Alfred the Great, that it wasn't the battles that people remember, it's what he did after that really made the difference.
Yeah, so you get this interesting with Alfred in the Start Pause, where he's a great general in the Start Pause because he's just won the Battle of Edington, but he's not quite the great governor yet. So you have the opportunity where you can push him in both ways.
So what is it that you actually do on the game?
So game director is a combination of being the lead designer on a project and also sort of ultimately being responsible for the project as a whole. So I'm dealing with the overall design of the project, its themes, its concepts, core feature set, and then I'm also responsible to make sure it happens.
So did you do the historical research for the game?
Yes, so as the game director, I am the prime sort of research person, but we have also worked with a historian, Dr. Neil McGuigan from the University of St Andrews, who helped out with some areas where there's questionable information for the time period. The worst area is Britain north of the Humber, because south of that you've got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is a very Wessex-based thing, gives lots of information for that. Wales, you've got the Annals Cambriae and stuff like that, which details that in the period. Ireland, there's 3 or 4 different annals from the time period. But Scotland, prior to about 850, there is information fairly regularly in Scotland, and that's because there's thought to be a annals held at the monastery of Iona. But that gets raided 3 times by the Vikings, and most of the monks moved to Kells in Ireland, which is where the Book of Kells comes from. But it means that with that move, the references become very rare for that part of Scotland, and even like Northumbria. So, because it's hard to get an entirely historically accurate depiction for that era because there's just not the records. He helped us give something that was historically plausible. You know?
So do you read Reddit at all?
Yes.
Are you aware of my posts?
Yes, I am.
So I've become somewhat infamous for having made a post about Viking leg wraps. I don't suppose you have an official statement about that, do you?
Almost like the damn sandals.
And those stinking buttons on Empire.
Oh, don't talk to me about buttons. I was the unit design lead on Napoleon. I have too many memories of what kind of buttons you meant to get on different types of British Army uniforms. Like, that's great information for working the Napoleonic era game, but now I don't need that information, but it's still in my head. Bringing it back to Thrones and the leg wrappings, there's a bunch of different ones you see in the game. Yes, some are a bit looser, some are a bit tighter. It's to matter a degree of artistic style.
Now, you're talking about research a minute ago. Were there any particular books or movies that really inspired your direction for the game?
For me, it's much more about the period itself and like the research we do, because there's not many really great coverages that sort of do the whole of Britain and Ireland in this era. So you sort of have to read a lot of different books and a lot of different academic papers as well, and sort of build up a picture of the whole. It's sort of a bit like world building for like a fantasy or science fiction novel, where you need to accumulate all this information on stuff, a lot of which you won't use in the final game, but it helps tell you what the key flavour is for the period. You
originally came in from modding, though. Lance the Conqueror?
Yes, that was my Medieval 2 mod. Yeah, I became part of the mod community back with the original Rome. That was the first forum post I made. I started off doing graphic mods and then moved into sort of more gameplay stuff. But the first mod I made was like a new skin for the Spartans, because of course that's how most people started their Rome 1 mods. Oh, I will do the Spartans my way. Yeah, and it's great. I found the first post I've made on the modding forums a while ago, and it was 14 posts in a row by me trying to advertise my stuff. I was absolutely a noob.
Do you think your experience with modding has given you a different approach for Thrones?
To a degree, but it's also been the experience working on the new content for Rome 2 and Attila. Because with those, you have this feature set you inherit from the main game, and that imposes certain restrictions on what you can do. Because you can't just completely redo stuff. You've got to fit with the existing UI and players' expectations. But over working on those, there's been a list of stuff of going, oh, well, I'd like to try this a bit differently or this a bit differently, and that sort of helped form the core of what became the Thrones design.
I think that's just a great summary for how Thrones feels in general. I mean, it takes a lot of the existing systems and either tweaks them or just removes them outright if they feel superfluous.
For me, games are always, the best games are more than a sum of their parts. Like, I know there's been a lot of discussion about what is and isn't in Thrones, but to me that discussion is slightly off, if you will, because what's important is how the game feels when you play it. Like, and from what we've seen with how people play the game, they're generally enjoying it because the game as a whole, you play it, and yes, there's different stuff to previous Total Wars. It means that the focus of players' time has shifted, but there's still a lot to do and a lot to draw you in and get you involved. And it's all about, for me, how the features that are in the game all tie into each other. So because we've got these provinces with more set sort of buildings in them, that has an impact on what governors you want to put in. And because we've changed stuff around traits and attributes, that impacts what characters are meaningful. And then, what buildings you build unlock your techs. And techs also impact your unit recruitment stuff. It's all about how it ties together and is more than its individual parts.
I think a great way of illustrating that is the new politics system. I never once really touched the politics system in Rome 2 or Attila. But in Thrones, I mean, you have to interact with it to succeed in the game, or you're just going to be overrun with civil wars.
Yeah, I mean, a big part of that is the focus on making it all about the kings. Like, in Attila, it was all, and Rome 2 degree, it was all about political parties. And Attila, it was your own family versus other families. But in Thrones, a king's position, didn't matter if he had family. Most of them are probably trying to be kings themselves. So it's all about making sure you've got a king of high enough influence to make sure you're not having loyalty problems. And then from there, managing your individual characters' loyalties and influence to keep things harmonious so you're not getting constant civil wars. And it's a balance that can shift a lot. Like, I've seen a lot of people playing it who've had a great king die and had their terrible son take over, and that has just completely derailed their campaigns.
I can only imagine, especially since loyalty scores have become so important in this game.
Because it's a lot of things we've done in. So we've done things like, if you do have a low influence king, there's events that pop up which can give you a buff and influence for a few turns, but in response for a penalty, like maybe the army will offer to support you. And you'll get, I'll get a bunch of influence for a number of turns so I can try and do other things to boost my faction leader to sort of get myself out of this hole. But your armies will cost 25% more upkeep for a number of turns. So it gives you more of these interesting choices as well that tie into it all.
I was playing Warhammer 2 recently with my wife, and long-term players forget just how many new systems have been added to the game, even since Medieval 2. And, Thrones is the first game in a while that I feel like really takes the Total War formula and boils it back down to the essence of what makes it great.
Yes, I mean, so I first got into Total War with the original Medieval, and that has had a big impact on how I sort of approach stuff, because for me, the original Medieval, it was quite a simplistic game. I know it's held in high regard in the fan base, and it was a great game for its time, but in terms of the campaign gameplay, it was quite simple. I'd say probably too simplistic now, because it didn't have the depth to diplomacy or faction management kind of stuff. But it did have a great sense of flavour, the way the map looked, the sound of moving objects, the images, all that kind of stuff.
So you've been working on Thrones for how long now?
It's over 18 months.
If you've been working on it that long, a question like this sort of loses all meaning at this point. But do you have a favorite faction to play?
No. Thrones is interesting because we have, each one does bring something a bit differently. Now, previous Total Wars I've worked on, I've generally had a favourite faction, especially when I was unit design lead, because you spend so much time putting together these units, you sort of go, I really like the look of these ones. But for Thrones, because we've managed to get them with their own sort of unique flavour, and with the events that go on, and their faction mechanics and stuff, and because of the nature of the setting where there are some overlaps between different faction rosters and stuff like that. Though saying that, even in Shogun 2, I had a favourite faction, despite the fact the faction rosters were very, very similar. My faction was Date, and damn it, I love the blue and gold colour. But with Thrones, I think there's a lot of replayability there in terms of how you go through and approaches each faction. Like I've played a couple of games recently, one is Sudriar, where because you're in the Western Isles of Scotland, you have a much more of a slower build-up because you've got to spend a bit of time moving around, there's no immediate threats with you, so you can have a bit more time to stop and consider. Whereas playing as someone like East Anglia, you're going to get in a war with West Saxon at some point. That's a big early conflict that just completely takes up your focus really early on.
And that was a really interesting choice you guys made on your end to go with as close as you can. I mean, the original Anglo-Saxon names for the countries.
Yeah, it was sort of because originally we did have them in sort of their modern spelling, but we ran into a real problem with a lot of the minor Danelaw factions, like what are the five boroughs, places like Cambridge, Nottingham, and stuff like that. It didn't feel great getting a message going, oh, you've been attacked by the Vikings of Cambridge. It's like, have they come down the river on little punts from the university or something? Like, that was when the decision was made to go for as close to the original spellings as possible as we could, whether that be Old Norse, Old English, Old Welsh, or Old Irish.
Is there any aspect of Thrones of Britannia that you're particularly proud of?
That's a really tough one because, sort of going back to the discussion earlier about the focus of the features and stuff, it is all about how everything comes together. Like, I will say that I absolutely adore the event movie art. Like, we've got the intro movies and the little events and stuff. I think that's fantastic. Yeah, that was something that we had quite a bit of back and forth on. Like, we recently went for something that was maybe a bit more illuminated manuscript in style. And it was our art lead, he was just experimenting with something and he said, oh, how about this? And he played it and it was just like, yes, that's the style we're going for. That feels fantastic.
Yeah, the like Viking stained glass look. I know it was inspired by the Stave Church in Norway, I think.
Yeah, so there's a bit of that. Anglo-Saxon Metalworks had a factor there, looking at how characters are depicted in illuminated manuscripts or the Bayeux Tapestry and stuff. It's a real sort of amalgamation of artistic styles. And like, hey, nice work.
So this is sort of the easiest segue possible into the hidden faction of Thrones of Britannia that's really only available in custom battles.
You have access to two factions not playable in the main campaign, the Normans and the Norse, because they're the two faction rosters that are represented in the single-player campaign factions. The Norse represent the Viking raiders and the late Viking invasions that can happen either through the Norse or the Danes. So they're a very classic Viking roster. Got Jom's Vikings in them, very cool. And then the Normans are the Normans, who can, of course, show up in as part of the Ultimate Victory editions earlier than they did in history. And they've got their own distinct unit roster that we wanted to allow players to enjoy custom battles and multiplayer.
It seems like it's sort of a similar mindset to the units in Shogun 2, where you have similar factions, but each one sort of specializes in a certain area.
Yeah, I mean, so there is sort of this core combat around the shield wall, but we have, where possible, tried to push it between factions. So the Irish get very javelin-heavy guys, and their units tend to be less heavily armoured, and they move faster a bit more, so they can get quite a bit of nice skirmish mobility stuff going on. Welsh, you've got longbowmen, who are the best archers in the game, and they've got really good cavalry, so they can certainly take advantage of that. Much more about sort of using great spearmen to pin the enemy in place whilst you use your other units to move around them and deal with the damage. Shogun 2 is probably the closest comparison, but I think there's a lot more diversity there than Shogun 2 had, which was very much focused on that rock, paper, shotgun, very precise balancing between different units. Rock, paper, shotgun, rock, paper, scissors.
Not sure how you play it, but man, that's a violent way to go about it. Yeah, no, I'm right there with you on that. I think you guys have done a tremendous job of expressing just how much diversity there was in this, one tiny geographical area. I mean, just taking the Gaelic faction and dividing it between the Irish Gaelic and, the Scottish Gaelic. I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, I mean, I know it's one that seems to have caused a bit of consternation amongst our Scottish fans. Whilst the conversion entirely to Gaelic is probably not finished at this point, the ruling class of Scotland spoke Gaelic, so it's the most logical place for them to go. I mean, they do have their own distinct roster, and they've certainly got some nice flavour stuff in terms of how they play.
Now, over the course of this, have you managed to pick up any Old Gaelic, Old Norse, Old Welsh?
Oh no, I can't pronounce any of it.
So over the course of the development of Thrones, I mean, you've been in constant contact with the community, your own forums, Reddit, Facebook, Twitter, Twitch. You've even responded to some of my questions, which has just, floored me. Why take the time to do that?
I think it's very much because of my background, like being part of the mod community. Like, I was a moderator and admin of one of the fan forums before I joined the company. I was involved all the time and made far too many posts. I think I had something like 17,000 posts on one of my pre-CA accounts. Projects I've worked on, I've always liked to try and keep up that kind of communication because it feels sort of true to my roots.
You know, at least from my perspective anyway, it's been really nice to actually get a chance to look at the kind of behind the curtain and see the logic behind a lot of the design choices and see where you guys are coming from on a lot of these.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly been useful because Thrones. There was this perception at first that maybe it was just Attila version 1.5 or something, which it's not. Like, so much has changed in the campaign, but it has surprised people often what changes we've made. We want to make the best games we can, and we want games that our hardcore fans will love. And so taking the time to explain it just sort of helps go, there has been a reason behind this decision. This hasn't just been a quick snap judgment we've done. A lot of thought has gone into this because we want to make the best game we can.
I guess the next big milestone for you guys is the release date of Thrones on May 3rd. I believe originally it was pushed back about 2 weeks from its release date.
Yeah, 2 weeks from the original, which was the 19th of April.
So what kind of changes can we expect in this next release? I mean, what did you guys spend those 2 weeks doing?
So the main thing was really looking at kind of feedback we were getting on how battles were playing and feeling. I mean, there's already been some influencer videos that have gone out from Milk and Cookies Total War. I can't remember what he also goes by. He put out a video which went over a lot of the kind of changes we've done. Improvements to balancing, tweaks to animations and what animations get played and stuff. So there's very much more of that shield wall feeling, getting the pacing right. We got into some improvements to battle AI. We've made some extra UI polish improvements. It was really about taking that bit of extra time we needed to really hone the polish on it to make it the best it can be.
Now, you've added some really interesting effects to this game. Probably the most interesting to me is the new critical effect that's been added to units.
Yeah, I think it's a nice little additional balance to the combat system we've had since Rome 2 with the way there's hit points for units. Like the old combat system we had, sort of Shogun 2 and before that, which was an adjustment to the one in Rome 1, Meg 2, it was pretty similar in terms of the rules. That had a lot of special cases in it for like infantry v cavalry stuff. Like we had to have lots of little special code in there to accommodate and balance it properly. Whereas when you went to the hit point system from Rome 2 onwards, it meant that a lot of that just fell out naturally from the combat system because cavalry have more hit points than infantry. So you can give them similar stats, so players can easily go, oh, these guys are better than them, but you'd get the sort of combat duration you'd expect because the cavalry can last twice as long. But it did mean that at times missile fire could feel quite weak because you don't want missiles doing enough damage to kill a guy on a single hit, generally, because everyone would die in the first volley. But if the damage is lower, it takes quite a while for the first few casualties to really start happening. Like the soldiers are being worn down, but if you're not seeing the soldiers dying, it can often feel like it's being ineffective. So adding the critical hit chance means that you're getting those little hits that are getting the way in between the armor, the arrow in the eye, that allows for there to be casualties happening all the time, whilst also still having this nice underlying hit point system that allows to show soldiers being worn down by repeated hits, how that affects combat too.
I'll admit when the idea was first announced, I was a little skeptical. I already run my general in and kill him enough as it is, but you guys actually added in a really cool little failsafe to keep that from happening, those just random deaths.
Yeah, you have to lose 70% of your general's unit before he dies. It just plays nicely with the emphasis of Thrones as well. Characters are hugely important. Getting this really great general having been the first one to die in a battle is quite anticlimactic. Whereas now, you still have to be cautious with them, but you can feel comfortable throwing them into the fight as well.
18 months is a long time to be working on anything, and if it's anything like video, I mean, by the time you get ready to release it out into the wild, you're just on pins and needles waiting to see how people receive it.
Yeah, it is the point now where it's pretty much done. It's going out for reviewers, and I have to wait and see. Up until this point, I've had total control over a project. Now I have no control.
Well, it seems like you've really crafted something that people are enjoying, and I really just wish the best for you. Thanks for taking the time to sit down with me, and look forward to playing the game when it releases on May 3rd.
No problem.
Well, I'm sure you have a lot left to do before that date comes, so best of luck out there.
Pleasure to speak to you.
Now, Thrones of Britannia will release on May 3rd and is available for pre-order now. I'll be releasing more Thrones material soon, so stay tuned for that, and as always, thanks for watching.